Hello guys, today we're going to talk about the Thailand predicament over the post-financial crisis in 1997. There's no doubt that Asian economy before 1997 was considered as the peak. So with this amount of economic boom, the idea of greed became the main drifter of the Thai society as a whole. It got to the point that individuals are so greedy, and the Thai stock market, the commodity and the real estate reach all-time high every week. And it's got to the point that the individuals are making loans from the bank in order to make profits from those markets. So at this point, the hunger for more growth are obviously seen. This amount of greed was one of the factors that create the policy that contribute to the fall of the economy as a whole. That policy is the unsustained market liberalization. From fixing the Thai baht at 25 Thai baht per $1 to the allowance of the foreign loan, the society has inadvertently created a loophole, the big hole that will cause the fall of the Thai economy. After the collapse of the economy in 1997, the action for recovery was a must. Nonetheless, the recovery was very challenging at that time, as there are so many factors that have to be considered, such as the internal factors and of course the external factors. In this video, the viewer will see how Thailand get passed through the crisis by using the foreign policy analysis theories of multi-level approach, in which we're going to emphasize the two-level game and also the win sets, and also explain how the foreign policy were enacted by the Chuan government and also the foreign actors such as the IMF, China and also Japan. So what exactly is the multi-level approach? In foreign policy analysis, we usually analyze the factors that influence the decision making and also the decision makers by investigating the manipulated and aggregated factors. In any negotiation or meeting, the administration usually takes part in two levels. This term was introduced by Robert Putnam in 1988. It involved both domestic and also international level. In this two-level game, the head of government representative are considered as the chief negotiator, and this chief negotiator will participate in international stage, in which the negotiator will secure domestic interests and secure domestic support for ratification. At the international level, the elected representative will bargain with one another to ratify the discussed concern, preferences and domestic pressures. At the domestic level, actors will interact among domestic political institutions such as the cabinet, the parliaments and political party. In fact, the ratification process is the virtual conceptual link between the international and domestic level. After ratification, policymakers will take these public opinions and approval to attend. At the same time, the set of likely outcome of negotiations and the set of agreements will eventually achieve local approval is defined as the leader's win set.
Okay, so now we will talk about the two-level approach game, and we will apply them to the post-Asian financial crisis. So the situation will be split into levels, which are the national level and the international level. Let's begin with the national level. So the interest groups at that time were the hundreds of thousands of independent investors, more than 90 financial institutions, real estate industry. So most of them were private sectors and private industries. They were the crucial stakeholders in this crisis. So these groups were the backbone of the Thai economy at that time. They were very influential when it comes to the verge of them collapsing. They pressured the government to comply with what was given to the IMF. Another actor was the government. We focus on two of the prime ministers during that period. They were Prime Minister Chawalit Yongchayut and Prime Minister Chua Lik Phai. So what are their motivations? Is it personal beliefs or is it for gaining political influence? Most people might say that both of them do it for political influence to regain influence in the cabinet and for themselves and for their own political parties. But however, both of them try their best to solve the crisis as well. Both the prime ministers, they have very little knowledge about how to run the economy or how to solve when it comes to this big financial crisis. So their visions were not that wide at all. They didn't see any other ways to solve this financial crisis other than comply with the IMF. The third actor was the bureaucratic system, which the dominant player in this level in the bureaucratic system was the Minister of Finance, particularly Mr. Thanong Phithaya and Mr. Thalin Niman Hemin, the former and the current minister during that period. So what did they constituted to the Prime Minister in terms of like them making decisions and stuff like that? They were both influential in terms of the Prime Minister's decisions. For example, Mr. Thanong Phithaya, he was the one who proposed the Prime Minister Shawalit to decide to float the Thai baht because the previous minister before him, he messed up the whole monetary management system. Mr. Tharin, on the other hand, he was a crucial part of Thailand's letter of intent to the US and the IMF. He was set with one of the most important missions, that is to lobby the US Department of Treasury to help unlock the harsh conditions of the IMF's package. He was also the one who was ordered to upgrade Thai commercial bank standard into a more globally acceptable one. On the other hand, the international level has two actors. The first one was the international financial institutions or the IMF. The IMF provided two phases of financial package for Thailand. Phase 1 was during Mr. Shawalit and phase 2 was during Mr. Chuan. The second actors of this international level of Thailand's foreign counterpart, which were the USA, particularly the Department of Treasury, where Mr. Tharin was sent to talk with them, to negotiate with them, to unlock the harsh condition of the IMF package. Now let's talk about Thailand wins in the two phases of negotiations with the IMF. Despite the fact that both IMF packages failed to create any positive impact, the wins that both of the chief negotiators carry to the international arena was quite large. We can see from the strict IMF package and the short-term type of loans that they will surely hurt Thailand's financial institutions and the government. However, Thailand still ratifies the policy offered by the IMF despite the consequences that I mentioned above. So what made Thailand's wins so large? Is it because of the collapse of the economy that rendered Thailand's power of negotiations down to almost nothing? Thailand lacked the economic capabilities to help maintain the once powerful international influence. So now we will talk about the determinants of the wins during Prime Minister Shawalit and Prime Minister Chuan. So in Prime Minister Shawalit's administration, there are two levels, the domestic level and the international level. Let's talk about the domestic level first. This first phase was during the Prime Minister Shawalit's administration. The institutions and the interest group, most of them were almost non-existing at the time because due to the shock of the collapse and stuff like that. But the private and public financial institutions like the Commercial Bank or the Bank of Thailand still held a lot of influence over the government's decision. How do they have that much of influence, you may ask? So if the financial institutions of Thailand during that time collapsed or like going worse, like down further than it has already become, Thailand will have a really hard time recovering from that period. In the international level, Prime Minister Shawalit's negotiating strategy was to comply with the IMF package without much resistance. Phase 2. During Prime Minister Chuan's administration, his domestic level of influence, the determinants of his wins were the cabinet. However, the cabinet, like both the government coalition and the opposition coalitions, they were actually trying to solve the crisis. The influence of the failing financial institutions are still dominant because the first implementation was a failure. And in the international arena, Chuan's strategy was to send his finance minister Thailand to lobby the US government, or particularly the US Department of Treasury and the Bank of America, into pressure the IMF to loosen the harsh conditions. Thailand's windsets reduced in size during Prime Minister Chuan's administration. However, the size of the sets are still very huge because Thailand didn't have any other choice than to loan the money from the IMF to recover its own economy. So Thailand complied with the IMF as easy as it was in the first phase. On the other hand though, IMF windsets were very small. They did not really care because it knew that Thailand is in need of financial aid. So Thailand will be the one who needs to comply with the IMF windsets instead.
Now we will be talking about the levels of bargaining. The levels of bargaining will be breakdown into two levels, the first and the second. The first level of bargaining refers to the idea of bargaining between the international level in the negotiation that will lead to the tentative agreement between the two actors. In this case, we'll be talking about how Thailand and the IMF tries to bargain the monetary policy which can aid Thailand's financial loss due to the instability of the Thai baht and the instability of the economic themselves. Led by Japan, China, and other major powers, the IMF agreed to place Thailand on a 3-year standby agreement worth $17.2 billion, in which will help Thailand quickly achieve successful exchange rate and restore financial market stability. Japan contributed the most with around $4 billion to match the IMF's contribution into helping the bailout plan for Thailand. Other states such as Singapore, Malaysia, and China contributed around $1 billion, while other major countries such as the US, France, Germany did not contribute in the monetary fund, but however will contribute in other factors instead. The conditions of the loan state that the government must adhere to the IMF's goals in order for the loan to be approved. The goals included 1. Restoring and stabilizing the Thailand's Thai baht through a high interest rate policy. 2. Raising the capital requirement for all financial institutions. 3. Suspending liquidity infusion to failing financial institutions. 4. Disclosing the size of the reserve every 2 weeks. In addition, Thailand was required to restructure its financial sector as a part of this deal, which include plans to close insolvent financial institutions and a temporary pledge to protect existing financial institutions. To boost the confidence of the IMF, Thailand's Minister of Finance gave the Bank of Thailand, or the BOT, authority to order commercial banks and finance firms to write down their capital to below the value stipulated by the law, allowing them to distribute shares increase without having to hold board meetings. Furthermore, there has been an amendment to the BOT Act of 1942, in which reaffirms the government desire to develop the Financial Institution Development Funds, or the FIDF, to provide full financial support to depositors and creditors. The amendments not only help in debt financial institutions to secure over 400 billion baht, but it also has helped boost the improvement and the credibility of the loan to be used with compliance with the IMF's requirements. Now, on to the second level of the levels of bargaining. The second level of bargaining refers to the idea of dividing negotiation with each domestic parties of constituents on whether to ratify the agreement reached. The Prime Minister Chuan Pai has sent the right signals to the IMF and international financial markets following his victory, in which indicates the right signals that he wants the bailout plan to be implemented with Thailand's economic plans. To reaffirm their commitments to the earlier IMF terms, the administration sent a second letter of intent in which indicates that they wanted to continue and go along with how the IMF wanted it to be. The government intended to work towards a 1% surplus in 1997 to 1998 in order to ensure an orderly offset to the intended work towards the financial sector reconstruction. This also has sent a strong signal of the government's purpose to enforce the economic program according to the second letter. The 1% surplus program can be implemented by raising tax, reducing the state enterprise funding, raising utility prices, and decreasing real wages in the public sector. Furthermore, the government announced its goals in the financial sector restructuring to move forward with the recapitalize and improve the rest of the financial system by the year 2000 in order for the regulatory structure to be brought in line with the international best practices.
So here is our research finding. By using two-level game, we can break down the policy of the IMF and Thailand, focusing on the decision makers and their desire after the crisis happened. So we layering what each actor needs, then finding the common ground to ratify the IMF bailout agreement. In this way, the approach covers the concept of level of bargaining and fair ratification. The bargaining level helps in classifying the IMF option on how to deal with Thailand's situation in the Asian financial crisis. As it can be seen that Thailand has been left with no other choice but to accept the IMF harsh and strict conditions as a means of guaranteeing the money necessary to strengthen the Thai baht and support the country's financial institution. The analysis only looked at the common ground between the two parties, but not if the policymaker decision were ratified as the best choice for Thailand's greater good. This suggests that the analysis can focus on the compromise between an actor interest rather than attempting to determine the best outcome for all parties in the negotiation. Now we're going to talk about the research gap and the prospect for further research. Based upon our review of the articles on the chosen topic, the gap we found in doing this research is that the in-depth information is hard to access, since almost all of the in-depth information does not publish and release into the public eye. Solid evidence is hard to find. Most of the details are only flow in the inner cycle among the politicians, cabinet, and the policymakers. We can access not much information, so mostly we have to rely on alternative tools such as other research papers, commentaries, and even the news to gather the information using to analyze. That's made another gap. We have to be aware of the bias that is in the paper we read. Since the case is very interesting, many studies have explored Asian financial crisis in many aspects. They have often looked at the consequences, causes, impact, and the way each country deals with the situation and how they recover from the crisis. However, they often overlook the way country protect itself and the role of the domestic level in the crisis. So our group proposed that further research topic should be related to this topic. For example, country's perception toward itself before and after the crisis and how it affects the way government prioritize national interests and their foreign policy. Factors rather than foreign policy that make the country recovery from the crisis deviate in such a significant way, such as domestic affairs, people engagement, diplomacy, and leader perception. Role of the elite and the middle class in determining national interests during the recovery period, and to what extent they can influence Thailand's foreign policy in the recovery period.
In conclusion, the post-Asian financial crisis for the Thai's predicament has been analyzed through the multi-level approach of the two-level game. In our research, we have found that even though the policy was seen by many critics as one of the worst decisions that Thailand could take, there has been no other options, as we can see from the win sets and the levels of bargaining that Thailand has taken. Through our analysis, we can see that the financial crisis through the lens of two-level games can be seen as the common ground or the compromises that the IMF will be able to take for Thailand to be able to reconstruct the Thai baht and reach the stability of the Thai market. Thank you for watching.